be recording now. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Brilliant.
Perfect.
Right. Let's commence. Hang on a second. Let me just move and keep getting notifications. Right. So after all that, this is Dr. Samantha Brooke, who's going to be talking to us today about neural processes associated with appetite and impulse control, from eating disorders and addiction to coping with COVID. Dr. Brooks gained her PhD at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London in 2010, and she completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Uppsala University in Sweden, which is where I met her and been friends ever since. Dr. Brooks continues to collaborate on projects examining the brain processes underlying eating disorders in adolescents with comorbid mental health disorders. Her research specialises in the neural mechanisms of impulse control in various psychiatric conditions, including eating disorders and comorbid anxiety disorders. Dr. Brooks is currently a lecturer in cognitive neuroscience in the School of Psychology, Faculty of Health, Liverpool, John Moores University in the UK. So over to you, Samantha, and any questions, please, at the end, just pop them in the chat and we'll field them that way. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ellen. It's really a pleasure to come and talk to you today. I would have really liked to see you all in person, but what can we do? Yeah, it's really nice to still be in touch with you and to see the work that you're doing in your wonderful department. So hopefully today I will be able to convince you a little bit about how we can apply the research that I've done with colleagues over the last 10 years to the current COVID lockdown scenario. This is on the back of the King's study that was published in April that there are 3 types of coping with the COVID lockdown. Just before I start, can everybody hear me okay? If you say no, then
yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Great. Okay. So the outline of my talk is going to be as follows. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the subliminal emotional stimuli work that we did and the interaction with working memory, so how it interferes with working memory. I'm going to talk a little bit about the progress that we made in this field. This was still in London, looking at the neural processes of appetite control at the Maudsley using fMRI and voxel-based morphometry. Then I went over to beautiful Uppsala University in Sweden to examine, so whereas in London I looked at chronic adults with chronic eating disorders, in Sweden we looked at people, adolescents who had a new diagnosis of anorexia in the pre-starvation phase, so that we could look at brain responses independent of starvation. Whoops. Oh dear, I've gone. Where did I go? Oh no.
Still there, you're fine.
No, I've lost my PowerPoint. There we go, I'm back again, sorry. Sorry. And then from Sweden, I got the opportunity to go and do a second postdoc down in South Africa to apply what we learned about the anorexic brain to try and improve appetite control and working memory in people with substance abuse, particularly methamphetamine use disorder. And then finally, after 6 years, I came back to the UK, and I've been in the last couple of years looking at appetite and impulse control, and more recently in relation to this COVID response. So yeah, so before we start then, I'm just going to try and explain to you a little bit about why appetite and eating disorders are linked to impulse control and to addiction and these COVID responses, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So it's all to do with all these different things: restlessness, the prefrontal cortex is really important, attention, and so on, impulsivity, compulsivity. And this is sort of what I thought impulsivity looks like, really. We've got drug abuse there. You put off future goals, you put off your health, you put off making good decisions for your family in favour of that immediate hit of the drug or alcohol. People that binge eat, they often do it in secret, but they binge on very large quantities of food, lose control. This is a picture at the top here, middle, in South Africa, where gangs, there's gang violence, there's drug abuse, and so people really they join gangs to get sort of this sense of support that's lacking in the family. It's all very an impulsive, volatile situation. And then, of course, we see the current climate with people resisting the lockdown movement, taking risky decisions because they don't believe that COVID is a real thing. Black Friday, where people go scrabbling for all the latest gadgets, don't care if they're hurting each other, they just care about the latest TV. And then these lovely world leaders that we've got at the moment. I couldn't find a nice picture of Boris Johnson, sadly, but he looks a bit like Boris Johnson maybe. And then, of course, binge eating again there as well. So this is sort of what impulsivity looks like. And then, contrast that with a more pensive feeling, a more sort of reflective, not really responding to your motor impulses, but thinking about what the best decision, the best behaviour is to make. And I've got a nice picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's sadly died recently, who was a wonderful example of that sort of metered, reflective thought process. So there are quite a few models of impulse control, and these are just two of my favourites, one of which is ours, obviously. The first one is by Barry Everett. This is really to talk about, on the left-hand side, this is to talk about, or to conceptualise addiction. And people, it's a spiral, downward spiral, really, and people have, if you're impulsive or if you lack impulse control, you tend to have a genetic vulnerability to novelty seeking or impulsivity. And then if certain life events occur, and you end up, in this case, taking drugs, or your friends are taking drugs, but it's just an experimentation at first. But if you keep doing it, if you repeat the thing, then it becomes sort of a habit, it becomes conditioned, and then you take sort of binges. This also applies to eating behaviour in a way. And then over time, your executive control network in the prefrontal and striatal regions of the brain are begin to fail, really, begin to weaken. And then because of the repeated exposure, your executive control failure or the weakening of that system is unable to then control the intoxication. So it becomes a downward spiral. And Everett talked about a switch from ventral striatal activation, that's the nucleus accumbens, responsible for wanting and liking. And there's a switch towards more activation in the dorsal stratum, which is more sort of Pavlovian habit, stimulus response driven behaviours. So it really is seemingly, this deficits in impulse control have a real neural signature that can be seen in people with addictive behaviours. If you look at people with eating disorders, then on this second model by my boss in Sweden and I, on the left-hand side, we're looking here at impulsivity in relation to binge eating. So impulsivity is more associated with this binge eating behaviour in line with arousal. So it starts off, as an arousing stimulus, which provokes anxiety. So arousal can begin sort of subliminally, which then evokes this conscious feeling of anxiety. And then if you have an eating disorder, you're going to take one of two options, really, depending on your genetic predisposition and other factors. But if you're somebody who is a bulimic type person with an eating disorder, it's going to be an increase in bodily sensations, which correspond to this higher level of impulsivity. Conversely, people that tend to be anorexic, sort of restrictors, they have these sort of prefrontal belief systems that become OCD-like, obsessive compulsive disorder, compulsions. And people can veer between impulsivity and compulsivity. They can start as restrictors, and then they can get a little bit better and then become sort of bulimic. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle there as well. But the reason that I wanted to draw your attention to this was the difference between impulsivity, which is more sort of bodily sensations bottom up, and compulsivity, this restrictive behaviour, which is more top down, and a sort of failure really of the working memory system to effectively self-regulate. So there's this really nice framework for impulsive behaviour. So this is just setting the scene for what I'm going to show you in terms of the data that we've collected over the years. And just very briefly, I'll scoot through this, but it's a really nice framework for predicting whether impulsive behaviour is going to occur, particularly in the present climate of predicting whether people are going to be impulsively going out drinking, not wearing masks, not socially isolating. So the first pathway is the standard sort of impulsive pathway. You have a risky situation, could be drugs, could be overeating, could be going out without a mask, which leads to these impulsive processes, automatic affective associations, this approach, state motivation. You don't care how risky it is, you just want to engage in this positive behaviour. The second pathway is the control pathway, conversely. So this activates the executive control network, which incorporates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate striatum. And this really promotes self-control, working memory, reflection. So those pictures of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and those people reflecting on their behaviour. This is the reflective process. Pathway C is an interesting pathway because it moderates. It might be related to some of the variants in coping mechanisms that we see, coping strategies that we see in the COVID climate. So these are boundary conditions. I really draw your attention to this to remember for a bit later, because these are, things that alter, might be overstressed. Your child now might be back home after school, the school's closed. You might have decided to drink more alcohol at the weekend, so motivational state. You might have just, had enough of COVID. You might have just had enough of a particular situation. I'm referring to COVID a lot because this is where the talk is sort of leading. But these boundary conditions really moderate the effects on the ability of pathways A and B to whether they lead to risky behaviour or not. Pathway D is the sort of reflective process, which sort of inhibits the behaviour, the impulsive behaviours. Pathway E is the rational sort of, so sometimes it is good to take risks, for progress. So you're going to weigh up the consequences of your behaviour and whether it's the cost-benefit ratio is worth it. And then touching on Barry Everett's model that you have trait impulsivity as well. So if you have if you're predetermined to have a more impulsive personality, then that will lead to risky behaviour. Similarly, sensation seeking is another genetic predisposition. So all of these things we can consider when predicting whether impulsive behaviour is going to happen. And I'm really quite focused on this part, so strengthening this part to improve the amount of risky behaviour that we see. And risky behaviour could be eating disorders, could be starving yourself, could be overeating, could be drug taking, and it could also be COVID lockdown responses. So just a quick summary of this work that I'm going to describe to you briefly that we've done over the last sort of 10 years. Started off in London through to PhD, postdoc in Sweden, second postdoc in South Africa, a lectureship for a few years in South Africa, and then finally back to Liverpool for this lectureship. So, and in all of this time, I've sort of had this in the back of my mind. This was a model developed in London where you have restricting behaviours on one end of the spectrum, normalcy in the middle. So we all do sort of veer between restrictive and impulsivity quite normally, but it's if it, trips through over into the extreme behaviour. So on this side, you've got binge eating behaviour, drug taking, impulsive risky decisions, and this relates to dorsal stratum, amygdala, cerebellum, hypothalamus, and some genetic markers, BDNF, which is a brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And in both cases, because of the imbalance between these systems, you have dysfunctional upregulation of serotonin receptors. On the other side, it appears that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate are some of the brain areas that are associated with this ability to hold in mind cognitions that allow you to self-regulate. So I'm just going to go through some of these times, where we collected some of this data. So the first bit of data that I did for my master's and PhD, we looked at the unconscious conflicts, these unconscious conflicting neural processes and how they impinge on working memory. And so these were the sort of the main papers that we published to look at this problem. And the first thing, so I'm just going to show you the main findings of these studies. And the first one really demonstrated that people with anorexia, so people with anorexia are on the black bars, and the health controls are on the white bars. And what we found actually was that on the left side, you've got the easier working memory task. So this is errors during the MBAC working memory task. And we found that obviously all of the groups tended to make less errors in the easier condition, but in the more difficult 2-back, obviously the errors increased. But it was interesting to see that subliminal images of any type, we didn't distinguish between food or aversive images in this particular study. But the people with anorexia, they tended to be much better at working memory in the more difficult condition than the controls, until we presented the images supraliminally, which means that they could see the images, but they were instructed to ignore them. So they weren't really able to ignore these images, and that's probably because their sort of working memory system, which is typically used to focus on this task, was engaged in suppressing the emotional responses to these images. This was an early study. We then progressed this work. We again used the backward masking procedure for the subliminal stimulation. We looked a little bit further to unpack what was going on in that subliminal study. And so we showed an image of food, or aversive, nasty images, or neutral images that were matched to the food. I'll show you an example in just a second. Very, very briefly. And it wasn't the brief presentation of the image that made it subliminal, but the backward masking, which had the target or non-target letter, and then a brief pause between blocks. And these were some of the images that we showed. So this was food paired with the neutral images very closely, so that it was the emotional content of the food that sort of evoked the subliminal response. I haven't shown the aversive images because they're not very nice, but they're the International Affective Picture System images. Sorry for the slight blurring of this picture, but what we found, and it was quite interesting, is that, and again, the patients are in the black bars, the health controls in grey. When we presented subliminal aversive images, which are quite nasty, it didn't really have an effect. There was a significant difference in performance. So the people with anorexia were making far less errors than the health controls. And the same applied for neutral. So again, a little bit less distraction, but still the people with anorexia were significantly better than the health controls. So they had a superior performance. But it was, I mean, obviously they're lower still, but it was only during the food images that this the subliminal images interfered with the anorexic patient's working memory. So we concluded from this that, again, it was the fact that working memory is somehow being used to suppress those emotional responses, those non-conscious arousing responses to the food images in people with anorexia, because for them, these are anxiety-provoking images. Yeah, so that's what I just said. And also in this paper, which I haven't shown the graph, but we did another study actually that showed if we increase the cognitive load, in other words, make the working memory task more difficult in healthy people, it prevented that subliminal interference. So you could improve that sort of distraction effect if you improved their working memory performance. So we carried on, and then we started looking at brain processes. So these were all neurocognitive or cognitive tasks. So then, and this was towards the end of my PhD. In fact, this was for my PhD, and we wanted to see what was going on in the brain. This was actually not a brain imaging study. This was just to look at the. There's a meta-analysis looking at the slowing of responses during a Stroop task. And in essence, a Stroop task is using sort of impulse control to avoid the distraction of these were food Stroop studies. This was to look at avoiding, or how slow they were at avoiding the distraction of the food words, where you have to, name the ink color of the food words. And just to quickly go through this, people with anorexia, people with bulimia, and then some studies that didn't differentiate. This was the 0 line here, and anything above the 0 line meant slower responses. The different size squares just means sample size. And just to briefly mention, the overall result of this meta-analysis was that, as you'd imagine, they were slower in their responses, which suggests that there's something extra happening in these people's executive function processes. So we carried on, and in 2012 we published this study, which was a voxel-based morphometry structural imaging study. And this I was really excited about, probably more so than my colleagues. But what we found, and this blue circle here, you're looking into the bore of the scanner, so this is the right side of the brain from the feet. And this is actually the DLPFC, the right DLPFC. And what we found, surprisingly, was that this part of the brain was significantly larger in people with anorexia compared to healthy controls. Now, that really can't be true because, when you're a chronic anorexic patient, your brain sort of shrinks. So didn't really believe that. It was such a strong finding, so it was quite strange. So we looked at it further, and we found that in age-matched healthy control women, there was an age-related atrophy. Atrophy is probably too strong a word. It happens to us all. But the volume of the DLPFC declines as you age. Sadly, I'm about here now. So, whereas in people with anorexia, there was no age-related decline in the DLPFC. So that suggests that they are doing something with their brain, some extra effort, which may take them longer in cognitive tasks, but there's some extra effort going on, which may save this sort of age-related reduction. And sure enough, we found that on a validated questionnaire that measures restraint, the more they restrained, the larger their volume was. So it wasn't actually larger than the healthy controls, really. It's just that the healthy controls were shrinking. And this was mediated by BMI, which means, in layperson's terms, really, that the heavier they felt they were, the more they restrained, they used their restraint cognitions. So that was a structural voxel-based morphometry study. And in one of the two fMRI studies that we had, we showed that in comparison to bulimic patients, the anorexic patients had a reduced sort of striatal activation. Striatal activation is quite active in people with bulimia, which is the reward response to food, really. This was in response to food images, asking them to think about eating food. So that suggests that this restraint process is actually dampening that reward response in anorexic patients. I'm conscious of the time, so I hope I'm not talking too fast, but I'll crack on. So then in Sweden, we looked at these effects in adolescents, just people that had an early diagnosis of anorexia, to see if we could spot any risk factors in the brain. And in Sweden, it's quite cold, so I imagine it's cold here today, also in the UK. But we published quite a lot in that wonderful lab. And this was just some of the findings that we found. And actually, we discovered that this OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder network, was lighting up in people with an early diagnosis of eating disorder. So this was independent of starvation effects in this sort of executive control network. And this is quite difficult to see, but just in essence, this is showing that these some of these regions in the executive control network were significantly correlating with subscales of the obsessive compulsive inventory, attention and cognitive complexity was correlating with some of the brain areas, as was all of the eating disorder concerns. And in total, impulsivity was much higher in people with eating disorders than health controls, as was the obsessive compulsive scores. And then just to look at the opposite side of the spectrum, if you remember that spectrum model at the beginning, we also in Sweden looked at a large group of structural images to see whether obesity had the opposite sort of signature. And it was true. We found that people who were obese took significantly longer to complete a working memory task, and this was associated with reduced brain volumes in this executive control network. So they were worse than people with eating disorders. It's a bit like an inverted U-shaped curve, actually, because I used to think that people with anorexia are much better at working memory than people who are obese or a healthy population. But in actual fact, it seems that they're using their working memory very specifically to control their emotional responses to food. So in general, people with eating disorders are not very good at working memory in everyday life. So taking all this evidence, I flew down to Cape Town and had a nice time in the sun for a few years, but also worked and did some work looking at whether we could strengthen the working memory processes in people with methamphetamine addiction. We developed this working memory training app, which is basically just an MBAC task. There's another one that's currently available called CogMed, which is actually created by Karolinska Institute. And in this study, it was very exciting because we found, so it's not really easy to see here, but maybe on this axial plane is easiest to see, that after 4 weeks of working memory training, and I'll come on to in a moment some of the criticisms of working memory training and hopefully rebut them, after just 4 weeks of working memory training in these methamphetamine adults, there was a significant increase in bilateral basal ganglia volume. And this coincided with, so the red line is the treatment as usual group, and the blue line is those that had additional working memory training. And what we found after 4 weeks, the impulsivity score, this was self-report, fair enough, but it significantly reduced, and the self-regulation score significantly increased. So these people, in contrast to the treatment as usual group, felt subjectively less impulsive and more able to self-regulate. And these were gangsters, you know, those sort of people in the township. So that was a really good thing, because most of them had young families that they wanted to spend time with. And the other interesting point about one of these papers was that we found that at baseline, if their DLPFC was not as impaired, this was a structural study, by the way, we're still analysing the fMRI, but if their DLPFC wasn't as badly impaired at baseline, they had a much better change in their self-regulation at follow-up. So it seemed to be the case that you know, if there was less damage, that they did better in the intervention. So yeah, this was something that I wanted to briefly mention to rebut some of the criticisms of working memory training, because one of the major problems of working memory training is that people don't really believe that over the long term it's going to do anything. It's going to have what's called far transfer effects, which means the ability to improve quality of life. Working memory does claim to improve working memory and attention deficits and other quality of life measures, but critics are really quite fierce that they don't really believe it. But in this paper, we suggested that maybe we're looking in the wrong place, that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet, because maybe neural processes are better able to detect changes. And also in relation to impulse control. And impulse control hasn't really been examined to a large extent in the working memory training literature. And in this quite extensive review, which we've just published in the last month, we found that the brain imaging studies of working memory training were showing reduced brain activation in frontoparietal and striatal networks, which suggests increased efficiency in these neural circuits. And we also found that quite a few studies demonstrated that the effects can be enhanced with transcranial direct current stimulation, which is a sort of quite easy to use measure to stimulate brain processes. And it may also be related to catechol-O-methyltransferase, which is a metabolizer really of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. So it may well be an effective non-invasive intervention for working memory deficits. So do read that paper, hopefully it will convince you. I just wanted to put this slide up to remind you that, what are we controlling here when we talk about impulsivity? And so these are just some of the studies that we did on this. And actually, so this top-down control is trying to regulate, trying to control this bottom-up non-conscious arousal, that can occur in response to changes in the environment. And we found that this nice network, including the anterior insular cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a gateway to the prefrontal system, and the fusiform gyrus, which is a part of the visual system that's activated to non-conscious visual stimuli, is activated when you're processing non-conscious emotional stimuli. So it's not something that's easy to consciously choose to do, but I think strengthening that top-down control is an indirect way to then try and regulate these bottom-up processes. So just to end my talk then, so in the last couple of years I came back from Africa. My tan has disappeared, and now I'm working in Liverpool, which is a lovely city. It's very cultural normally, but at the moment we're about to go into lockdown. So and I've got these are three separate things here that I want to show you. So in this first column, these are people that seem to be accepting the COVID responses. They're doing the social distancing, they're wearing their face masks. But the people in the middle here, they tend to accept the COVID lockdown responses, but they're really stressed out about it. They're anxious and depressed. They're really finding it hard. There's a variance in the amount of coping that they feel. And then, particularly in Liverpool, because we're one of the hotspots now in the UK, we've seen all this across the country. I don't want to blame students. We've all had a nice time at university, but there is an element of resistance there going on. Flouting the rules, not wearing the masks and things. So this was found actually that there were three main types of response, and I'm nearly finished now, a couple more minutes. To the COVID lockdown. This was a study done by King's College London at the beginning of April, between the 1st and 3rd of April, I think, of this year. So just as we've gone into lockdown. And they did a K-means clustering analysis of it's a bit like a factor analysis. And the main responses were accepting, suffering, and resisting. So the acceptors, I know it's probably a bit small, but I'll just sort of really highlight the main points. The acceptors were the biggest group, luckily, in a way. And they said that they were following the rules completely. They didn't really lose sleep. They didn't feel that they were going to lose their jobs. They didn't think that life was going to return to normal anytime soon, but they did, believe in the government's response to it. They seemed to like Boris. And they checked social media less often than the other two groups. The next biggest group was the suffering group, and they reported feeling a lot more anxious and depressed since the lockdown measures were introduced. Interestingly, it's females of about my age that experience suffering, probably have suffered a little bit, maybe. Conversely, the acceptors tended to be men, so go figure. These sufferers, they said they spent much more time thinking about the coronavirus. They check social media, they check the news. They were following the lockdown rules completely. They did support police powers. They did, however, think that the government acted too slowly, and they were less likely to trust the information that was given to them. And then the smallest group of all were these resistors, and as you'll see in the next slide, that these tended to be the younger people in society, sadly, who really got the blame for most of it. And they said that they were only half the time complying with the rules. They thought that too much fuss was being made over it. They didn't do the official guide. They didn't follow the official guidance. And they would often actively do things risky decisions that would go against the official guidelines. And they would believe that it was a conspiracy, that it was created in a lab. They thought there'd be a quick resolution, that this is just going to be over soon. And they would often check social media for updates. So I just want to quickly, I'll show you the differences in those three groups in a second in terms of age, but I just wanted to highlight these two things, that sensation seeking really does reach a peak at around about 18 to 20. So that's, sort of university students, but it's university age students. We were all there once. I'm only jealous. It starts to dip down as you get older. And this corresponds to a very famous structural imaging study, which showed that the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, isn't fully developed until about the age of 25. So, that makes sense in terms of impulse control. And so if you look at the age distribution of this King's study in terms of the acceptors, sufferers and resistors, you see here that the majority are 55 to 75. The sufferers, that's quite variable, and then the resistors tend to be this 16 to 24 age group. So it really mirrors quite nicely what we know about the brain. A couple more slides left, almost there now. So does this represent, people, is this the way people respond if their prefrontal cortex is fully developed? Is their working memory system able to hold in mind these impulse control cognitions? This variable group could be because of those boundary conditions. If you remember back to that impulse prediction, predicting impulsivity by Weir at the beginning. And then, of course, could this represent an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex that we perhaps need to develop interventions to help strengthen, to improve the adherence to social distancing and mask wearing, etc. So just to end then, some brief conclusions from the research as a whole. So people with chronic anorexia have DLPFC-related excessive top-down restraint. And although it helps to avoid the distractions caused by subliminal affective stimulation, it is actually quite narrow, and it really does overall reflect a worse working memory performance. And food-related or emotionally arousing stimuli tend to overburden the working memory system and increase cognitive biases, distractibility, and OCD-type cognitions. So that also applies to these boundary conditions. If people are overworked, overstressed, then their working memory network is going to be diminished. And excessive cognitive control is associated with compulsive cognitions in anorexia, and it leads to sort of rigidity, dysfunctional interoceptive awareness and empathy. So it's not a good thing in overall life. And this reduced working memory ability is also seen in obesity and substance use. These working memory network regions seem to be strengthened with repeated working memory training, around about 15 minutes, 3 times a week. And this leads to sort of brain volume increases, and the excessive activation in the DRPFC and striatum is decreased, with some mediation of genetic markers, age, and the type of impulse control disorder. And I hope I've convinced you that, slightly over time, sorry, but I hope I've convinced you that, these impulse control deficits may be related to the small minority of people who resist the COVID lockdown, associated with these risky decision-making and sensation-seeking that we see, sadly, in the media. And this resistance to lockdown may reflect the maturity in prefrontal networks, or in older people that have an already burdened working memory network. And so these interventions to help improve working memory might improve, for example, acceptance of COVID lockdown rules. So I'm just going to flick through this really. So, it might not simply be impulse control per se, but it might be building tolerance. So it might not be about resistance necessarily, but this working memory network might be about the ability for us to hold in mind some negative emotions. So, for example, in the case of COVID, and we're all experiencing uncertainty, isolation, and fears about, are we going to catch COVID? Can we hold these negative emotions in mind instead of doing what the younger people are doing and going out and just saying, sod it, I'm going to just go and get drunk. And this was a nice by Jade Emery and colleagues about expanding this window of tolerance. So how can we go about sort of lowering hyper or hypoarousal, because that's another response, obviously, and improving this tolerance to these negative emotions. So that's me. I just want to say a quick humongous thank you to all the people that have mentored me over the years and people that are currently helping me. I've got Helgi Schott in Sweden, Professor Schott in Sweden, Prof Kate Cockcroft in Johannesburg. This is my current boss, Dr. Helen Poole. These are my 2 current students that are helping me with a massive study, which I haven't mentioned too much, that we're looking at these responses, working memory processes in 2,500 respondents of a study that we've just run. Rhiannon and Ben. This is Prof Mark Soames from the University of Cape Town, who's been a great mentor. Prof Dan Stein, he was the head of Department of Psychiatry in Cape Town. And this was my PhD supervisor, Dame now, which is a bit intimidating, Janet Treasure of the Eating Disorders Unit. So thank you for listening. I hope you're all still there.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was really, really interesting. And you have finished on time, so that's all perfect. So it'd be really nice if we might have a couple of questions now. Did you also have something you want to discuss in terms of data?
Yes, so I just wanted to mention that we just ran in the last couple of months a study, a contract study online. We've got some memory tasks that are measuring working memory, some self-regulation measures, impulsivity measures, and we're basically looking to see, based on these 3 COVID responses, how does working memory figure? Is it true that working memory is worse in for example, the resisting group? And so we do sort of need some help analysing this data. We've got a small cohort of about 10 people from Sweden, South Africa, and Liverpool helping us. It was initially intended we just thought we'd collect about 60 people, and it ended up being 2,500. So if anybody would like to get involved in that, we can send you the sort of overall measures, and we're asking people that are interested to send us a very brief 1-page proposal of the questions that they'd like to ask the data. And Ben there, who's got his EEG cap on, will send you that particular data, for sort of collaboration purposes and for publications. So if anybody's interested, please do email me, and we can start the ball rolling.
Sounds great. And obviously, if anyone doesn't have Sam's contact details, they can email me or Dennis and we'll forward that. So we have one question, and it's really difficult because obviously you don't see people's first name. So
Right, shall I take these slides off, Ellen? Shall I just escape it?
yeah, if you take the slides off, and then you should come up sort of full size. So the person with Flynn as a surname, I apologise, your first name doesn't come up. Would you like to ask your question? Turn your mic off and or not. Oh, he's showing off it. That's absolutely fine. Right, so the question is, you can probably see, can you see the chat, Samantha?
I can't actually, no.
Okay, so I'll ask the question. Regarding the adherence to COVID rules across age groups in the KCL study, it seems those around age 35 seems to be more evenly spread across the 3 levels of adherence. Any idea what the reason for that might be?
Goodness, that's a good question. Right. So regarding the adherence to COVID rules across the age groups, it seems those around the age of 35. So again, probably you could argue that, you know, so the pre-system is at its peak really around about sort of 25, 30. But then also maybe you start to get more responsibilities around sort of middle age, maybe. So you could argue that those boundary conditions are leading to a you know, more of a burden on that system. And so perhaps people of that age, that, you know, depending on your levels of responsibility, maybe that sort of determines that spread across those levels of adherence. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, isn't it? Maybe that's something we could ask this data. That's a bit of a cop-out, wasn't it? Sorry.
No, that's fine. You can always come back to it. Oh, we've got a thank you. Any other questions?
And I'm very happy to send the slide. Well, you can send the slides.
Yeah, we've actually recorded it, and yes, we'll share the slides as well. Obviously, there was a lot of information there to digest, so it doesn't look like we got any other questions. Oh, someone's put a hand up. Hang on.
Dennis. Oh, nice to
Dennis.
see you.
Yeah.
Oh,
Dennis.
Dennis.
We can't hear you, Dennis.
Oh. Can you unmute, Dennis? Or...
Oh, he's not.
Oh,
here he is. Hello.
hello. Oh, yeah, now you can hear me. Sorry, I clicked the button about 10 times.
Oh no, he's gone again.
No, he's here. Oh, hang on. We still can't hear you, Dennis. I'm really sorry. I don't know why.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, can hear you now, yeah.
Don't touch anything.
I don't have any luck with computers today. Maybe just go for a walk now. I was just wondering, because obviously you presented some data from the townships and some data from eating disorders. So would we generally assume that the network impairments are generic for kind of all types of psychopathology, like conduct disorder, ADHD type, that kind of overlap with those? Because obviously some are more like impulsive, like overeating. I guess ADHD conduct would probably be more one group, and then the OCD related and restrictive eating would be another group with kind of more prefrontal top-down restrainment. But can we? So would we say it's kind of two overarching kind of network systems that would affect several kinds of psychopathologies, and because some of those overlap anyway, right? Because like conduct ADHD would be comorbid. I think I don't know about eating disorders and OCD, whether they overlap.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm sort of really trying to get a unified theory, you know, sort of linking both of those groups. But of course, I think there are other nuances, like impulsivity and compulsivity are sort of a two-dimensional spectrum, so that can actually alter things. And also, I'm quite interested in the difference between internalizing disorders and externalizing disorders, and men tend to have like externalizing disorders, conduct disorder, substance use, whereas females tend to have internalizing, you know, self-harm, you know, eating disorders. So there's obviously some other aspects there, and of course, you know, there are other types of restraint disorders, really, you could say. Off the top of my head, I can't think of them. I've just now said that, but obviously, you know, the other side is easier because you've got binge eating, you've got substance use, you've got ADHD, you've got aggressive disorders, antisocial disorders. So I think there are ways that you can link them based on this broad spectrum, but I also think that probably there are interesting nuances related to. We did a study also on childhood trauma, and the type of childhood trauma that you may have had can determine how it presents into adulthood. So, you know, like neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and a lot of the people in the methamphetamine group actually had physical and emotional abuse, often by the fathers. So, you know, it seemed like they were trying to get rid of those negative emotions that they were carrying around with them by medicating, really. So yeah, it's a very, very, very interesting question to tease apart these conditions.
Yeah, so I guess, because I was just thinking about the kind of RDoC framework, I guess, where they're trying to cluster, you know, different disorders under common brain developmental issues. Or
yeah, you've exposed me there, because I'm more of an RDoC person than a DSM person. So I quite like their approach, because I mean, they say that they're not in competition with the DSM, but I quite like it because it's a research-based criteria, and they're looking more at overarching, you know, positive valence, negative valence, social processes, cognitive systems, and arousal, I think, are the main areas. And so that's nice, because it's not then labeling people with a particular disorder, but it's looking at, you know, specific behaviours and cognitions across the different things. So yeah, recommend everybody to read RDoC. The research, the main criteria.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Right, it's 2 o'clock. So like I say, this is obviously being recorded, and we'll get the notes, the slides from Samantha, so we can send those out.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, obviously, I guess if anyone does have questions or are interested in the data, they can contact you. I'm sure you'll be happy to share that. So again, thank you so much for sharing your hour with us, and yeah, it's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you, and we'll stay in touch. And thanks everybody for coming. Have a nice day further.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha.
Stay on, Ellen, or
no, you can go when you're ready. Log off.
I'll drop you an email. Did you just tell me to bog off?
No, I said you can log off. You're just getting some thank you messages in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat.
Yes, but I can see it now. Actually, that's very nice. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day. Greetings to Southampton. I feel like I should stay until, yeah, that's it. Okay, see you soon.